Hello, welcome back to the Nook. I'm Daniel, and today I'm going to be talking about a very influential author on the fantasy genre. I know Tolkien was the original, but here we have Terry Brooks, who wrote this book first as his debut novel, which is The Sword of Shannara. And he went on to write many more in the series, and he wrote other series that I'm not going to talk about in today's video. Today is just going to be a discussion about his influence on the fantasy genre, who he was, what his books were about, keeping it spoiler free because I would love for any of you who haven't read him to get into his work. So I consider Terry Brooks to be one of the pillars of fantasy after Tolkien, because Tolkien really he wrote Lord of the Rings. I mean, The Hobbit was big, but then Lord of the Rings kind of changed the scope of fantasy. And Terry Brooks was kind of one of the first authors, writing in 1979, one of the first authors to kind of go back to that style of fantasy. So, The Sword of Shannara, this book here, it's very much a Lord of the Rings kind of retelling. It's got very similar characters. You could just, yeah, instead of Gandalf, you have Alanon, who's a druid instead of a wizard. You have Shay and Flick, who are like Sam and Frodo, and they live in Shady Vale, which is like the Shire. So it was very much he knew what he was doing. He knew he was making a very similar style of series, except I love it. I think it didn't feel like a ripoff, and then each book afterward kind of became more its own thing, not just Lord of the Rings. So then this series, Heritage, this came after the other two books, Elfstone and Wish Song, and Heritage is a series that kind of continues it, and it's four books. This is the big, heavy volume. You can lift weights with this. This is four books in one. So he wrote Sword of Shannara in 1979. Then he wrote The Elfstones of Shannara, Wish Song, in that series there, Heritage. So how did I get started with Terry Brooks? Well, when I was in grade school, like grade 6 or 7, my friend was telling me about The Sword of Shannara, and he was reading it, and I thought I'd read it too. So I took it out from the library, my school library, and I couldn't get into it. I started reading it, I found it kind of boring, and then I just kind of stopped, and I never went back to it in high school even. And then after high school, I was volunteering at my old school. I think I ended up reading to kids. And while I was volunteering, I had free reign of the library. So randomly, I just took out The Sword of Shannara and I read it, the whole thing. It's actually the biggest book in the series. And I read it and I was like, wow, that was really good. I took out Elfstones, I took out Wish Song, I took out the individual volumes of Heritage. I didn't have the omnibus back then. And Heritage ended up being my favorite at the time. And then he just kind of kept going with series after that. He wrote other series after Heritage and they all kind of connected. And his last book, his last Shannara book, was written in 2020. He's still writing books. He wrote other series that are unrelated, but Shannara was kind of his magnum opus, his big epic fantasy series. So that's kind of how I got into him. But what is Shannara? Well, Shannara is not actually a world. The world is known as the Fourlands. Shannara is this like elven lineage, and the sword of Shannara was made to be wielded by one of the lineage of Shannara. Some people think it's Shannara, some people think it's Shannara, but Terry Brooks himself has said it's Shannara is how you pronounce it. So what happens is like the first book follows certain characters, and the second book is like I think it's like the children of those characters or the grandchildren, and then each book kind of gets into more of the generations, right? So you have like the grandson of the character from the second book is in the third book, and then it goes on, and each book is kind of more generations of the Shannaras, more generations of the Omsfords. That's a name you're going to hear a lot is Omsford. So Shay Omsford is the main character of the Sword of Shannara. And then you have Will Omsford in Elfstones. So that's kind of who the characters are. It's just big, epic fantasy, lots of really good combat, and honestly, one of the best fantasy series out there. Yeah, so he wrote Druid of Shannara back in 2020. So he started it. He started the whole thing back in 1979 and he finished it in 2020. So that's quite a lot. And yeah, it just gets better as it goes. I loved The Sword of Shannara. It's one of my favorites. Elfstones, I might like even more. Elfstones was really good. And you might have heard of a TV series that had 2 seasons called The Shannara Chronicles. So the Shannara Chronicles, season 1 at least, the only one I watched, is based off of the Elfstones of Shannara storyline. Just because that was easier to adapt, it wasn't just like Lord of the Rings, because Elfstones wasn't at all like Lord of the Rings, whereas Sword of Shannara was. I thought the show wasn't that good. Season 1, There were some aspects where I thought, yeah, that does feel like Terry Brooks' vision, but most of it was too. There was some sexual stuff, which he just doesn't have sexual content much in his books later on a little bit, but it's nothing explicit. And the show, it wasn't explicit. It wasn't Game of Thrones. It was just not the same feel as what Terry Brooks has written. And I heard season two just completely veers off from any other book, and it's just kind of lame. So a lot of people didn't really, Shannara fans at least, didn't care for the show. I didn't care for season one that much, and I didn't bother with season two. But the books are truly amazing. I would say Sword of Shannara is still one of my favorites. It's the one that for me is just this kind of cozy read, like it feels good to read. It feels like classic fantasy. And then Elfstones and Wish Song are both excellent. Heritage is my favorite by far. So the books in Heritage, I can show you. The titles here are The Scions of Shannara, The Druid of Shannara, The Elf Queen of Shannara, and The Talismans of Shannara. And honestly, those are all amazing books. The whole entire Shannara universe, I mean, it's just so good. And you kind of see the way the technology happens, where the beginning it's very medieval, and then later in the series they get airships and they get things that are almost like guns towards the end, so it almost goes kind of sci-fi. What's interesting with Terry Brooks is that yes, he has the main Shannara series, but then he has a prequel series called Genesis of Shannara. But on top of that, he wrote a series called The Word and the Void, which takes place in our world, and it's where there's these demons that are causing destruction, and there's these people called Knights of the Word, and the Knights of the Word fight the demons of the Void. That's why it's called The Word and the Void. And I found that very fascinating, and it was later considered to tie into the main Shannara books, because you could read The Word and the Void, and then Genesis of Shannara has kind of where our world has become post-apocalyptic, and it's all leading up to when there's a big nuclear explosion or whatever, and we kind of end up with the Fourlands. So it starts with our technology, our science, and then it becomes the world of fairy, which is where you get the Fourlands and you have the elves and the dwarves and all of them. So I found that very fascinating that Terry Brooks went from the technology and the science to more of a fantasy world. So you start the prequels with the scientific world, and then it moves into fantasy, and it kind of goes back to science in a sense because you get the airships and all that. And honestly, I think reading it, I read the entire series once, starting with The Word and the Void, and then Genesis of Shannara, and then there's Legends of Shannara, which is a duology, which is these two books. And then after the duology, I read first King of Shannara, which is the prequel to Sword. Then I read Sword of Shannara, and then onward. And that took me like a full year. I think a little over a year just to read all of those Shannara books. That's a lot. I mean, he's written other stuff. He wrote the Landover series, which I still think is great. I've read all of it, including The Princess of Landover. Landover is kind of this thing. I'm mainly talking about Shannara, but I'll mention a bit of Landover. It's this man from the States. He lives in Chicago, and he ends up seeing in a newspaper or an article that there's a magic kingdom that's for sale. And he's kind of, down and out. He thinks, well, maybe I'll buy this magical kingdom. So that's where the fantasy part comes in, because he finds himself in this land where there's a kingdom and it's going to ruin, and he meets a wizard. And anyway, so Landover was really good too. I highly recommend, if you want to read Terry Brooks and you want to read something that's not as much, I wouldn't say Shannara is a challenge, but there's so many books. If you want to read one with a little less books, Landover is really great. It's still very good epic fantasy. Other than that, he wrote Street Freaks, which is sort of this cyberpunk one-shot story that I thought was great. It was kind of Terry Brooks flexing his muscles to show he can write stuff other than just epic fantasy. Although I think his epic fantasy is the best part of what he writes. So Shannara kind of relies on druid magic and the elf stones. What's really cool about Shannara is it shows that people use magic, but it can be a problem. With the elf stones, it can become an addiction, where you get addicted to using the magic, and then it becomes kind of this problem. And then, or there's the sword of Leah, which is the sword that gets infused with magic, so it becomes super strong. And then the main character who uses that sword, he becomes addicted to the magic of the sword. So it's kind of dealing with that at the same time. So it's not showing magic as just an easy way to solve your problems. Magic can actually cause problems. Like the Wish Song and the Wish Song of Shannara, that came from extended use of the Elfstones in the lineage of the Omsfords. So honestly, it's all very fascinating stuff. I just don't want to say too much more because I would love for whoever else is watching this and hasn't read any of these books. I mean, they're excellent. I would almost just use your library like I did the first time because it's a lot of books to buy if you're going to be buying the Shannara books, which I did buy all of them, but I like to collect books. It's kind of what I do. So yeah, I'll just say it's a great series. I've absolutely loved every book I've read. I thought the prequel series was good. The War in the Void was great. Um, yeah, so if you're kind of on the fence, I would say check out either first King of Shannara or the Sword of Shannara and see what you think if his writing jives with you, if it doesn't. And yeah, kind of give it a go. I will say I just absolutely love his works and I always will. And I'm sure I'll be rereading the entire thing again probably a few years from now because I just did it not too long ago. So yeah, that's about all I wanted to say about Terry Brooks, about Shannara in particular. He's just a really great fantasy author who really got things going after Tolkien, which I appreciated. And yeah, so remember to like and subscribe. I don't know what my next video is going to be, but I will find out and you will find out. So remember, you're always welcome at the Nook. Bye.